Thank you very much for inviting me to your conference. So I'm Nick from NatureScot. Till very recently, we were called Scottish Natural Heritage. The name was changed to make it even clearer what it is we do. So I hope you agree with that. I apologize in advance. I'm not an ecologist. I'm not a wildlife recorder. This talk is mostly pretty high level, but I hope it sets the scene somewhat for your conference. Now, reports and assessments certainly aren't everything, but some very important ones on biodiversity and climate were published recently. Starting at the global level, an impressive piece of global scientific collaboration started in 2008 when the United Nations kicked off IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. There was an urgent need to strengthen the way that policies on nature were being informed by scientific research and by knowledge, which of course includes wildlife recording. The idea of ecosystem services, that is, rationalizing biodiversity in economic terms, was pretty uncomfortable for some folk in 2008, and it still can be today. But it's getting ever clearer that livelihoods and alleviation of poverty, even human survival, all depend greatly on what biodiversity does for us. And it's clear that these ecosystem services have been overused and depleted for many decades. Last year, of course, saw climate change issues greatly accelerate. We had the special report on 1.5 degrees of warming from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and this showed that current action on greenhouse gas emissions was not likely to stop global temperature rise from having significant impacts on humanity, and these were going to hit the poorest hardest. Then, public awareness and protests about climate change and the loss of biodiversity took off worldwide. In the UK, the Independent Committee on Climate Change proposed a target for Scotland of net zero by 2045, and then this did pass into legislation after the First Minister announced a climate emergency in April 2019. Lastly, as I've said, IPBES brought out their global assessment for biodiversity and ecosystem services. And this report provided irrefutable scientific evidence of how biodiversity loss across the world has accelerated in the last 50 years. The assessment by IPBES found that more animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction than ever before in human history, many within just a few decades. Perhaps 10% of insect species are threatened, but that rises to more than 40% for amphibians. At least 1,000 breeds of mammals used for food and agriculture are threatened. Importantly, the report shone a light on the relationship that exists between economic development and harms to nature. The leader of the project said the report presented an ominous picture. We are, he said, eroding the very foundations of our economies, livelihoods, food security, and health worldwide. The report also told us it wasn't too late to make a difference, however, through transformative change that would ensure nature could still be conserved, restored, and used sustainably. Scotland has to play its part in this. The IPBES report not only detailed the impacts on nature, it also identified 5 direct drivers of those impacts. So, land use change is driven mainly by agriculture, forestry, and urbanization, whereas changes in management of the sea see the most impacts on biodiversity coming from fishing, but also land use changes do have changes at sea through pollution and ocean acidification, etc. Direct exploitation of the natural world saw the use of resources nearly doubling globally since 1980. Then there's pollution in the air, water, and soil, and invasive non-native species. Obviously, these impact native species and the way their ecosystems function, but invasives also impact the contribution of nature to society, from economic effects to human health. climate change is a direct driver, but it's also increasingly exacerbating the impact of the other drivers. So it is the biggest threat. And lastly, of course, what gives these drivers increased impact is two indirect drivers concerning how humanity relates to nature or doesn't relate to nature. Another key publication in 2019 was the State of Nature Scotland report. There are some key statistics up there. It's really striking that close to 2/3 of species population in Scotland have shown strong changes, and half of species populations that were looked at have decreased in abundance. I have to stress as well that a lot of the data that this study is based on comes from wildlife recording. Now for a couple of graphs. You have to have graphs when you're talking about climate change. You'll have seen many like this showing the increased global temperature since the Industrial Revolution. This one is from NASA's website. The lower line shows the global temperature that would be expected due to solar radiation without any human influence, whereas the upper line shows the actual change that's been observed, a warming of at least 1 degree globally. A net zero world is about avoiding dangerous levels in that temperature rise. To get there, greenhouse gas emissions must be balanced by removals, the sinks. Because technological sinks such as carbon capture and storage aren't yet proven, I'm focusing here on sinks through land use change. And in this sense, land use change needs to include everything from wild nature to farming and forestry. Scotland's emissions fell from 75 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent in 1990 to near 40 in 2017. And they're currently pegged to drop to near 30 million tonnes in 2030. The colours in the bar chart are simply different socio-economic sectors. What matters most is that dark green at the bottom that shows those carbon sinks through nature. In just over a year's time, the carbon accounting will be changed to include wetlands and peatlands. But depressingly, this is going to add 6 to 10 million tonnes to the emissions. That's because most of our bogs have peat that is degraded, and degraded peat is a net emitter of greenhouse gases. To be net zero by 2045, any residual emissions, including those from farming and from those degraded peatlands, have to be offset by nature-based carbon sinks. So that has to be through these changes to land use. So while nature-based carbon sinks were maybe regarded as nice to have from 1990, from here onward, nature-based carbon sinks are absolutely essential. This is because the global carbon budget for avoiding dangerous climate change has effectively been used up for all time already. Critically, the kind of land use change that delivers sustainable nature-based carbon sinks also benefits biodiversity, and it can very often also help us adapt to climate change effects. You really can't do one of these without the others, and they all need to be done in the same area, the same part of Scotland at the same time. This is what we call nature-based solutions. So to go through some of that again without the graph, the best way to store carbon is to not burn or release what's already stored, whether that's petroleum in rocks or soils such as peat. Healthy vegetation, soils, and marine environments lock up carbon and limit emissions. You can see the main carbon stores here: peatlands, woodlands, so-called blue carbon, such as in estuary flats and salt marshes, and finally, agricultural soils. As we've seen, changing how we manage land to increase the carbon sequestered into these stores is crucial to reducing future climate change. Some climate change, of course, is already locked in. So richer and more diverse vegetation and soils are critical to help nature adapt to the warming climate. For example, the northward movements that have been observed in certain bird and butterfly populations. A rich, diverse nature can also help us adapt by, for example, reducing heat waves in cities, protecting soils from loss, reducing flood risk at the coast, and supporting food production. Now it's time to come back to the part that's played in all this by observing changes to wildlife. Here are two interacting trends involving climate change effects that have been seen in Scotland. And I should say, I've headed this adaptation. This isn't really adaptation, which is usually defined as something you do deliberately, but never mind. Some whole landscapes are, to a degree, losing some of their structural diversity, losing the specialist species in particular. How have trends like this been established? Well, often it's through wildlife recording. As long as the data that's provided goes to repositories like NBM, it can be used to establish biodiversity indicators, which you may be familiar with on the NatureScot website. The data is also heavily relied on for research into how climate change will affect nature in future. That research, in turn, informs the UK Climate Change Risk Assessment. That's a study that's updated every 5 years and that directly shapes public policy and priorities. So please never underestimate the potential of your wildlife records to go far. Here's just one example of research built on big data on species. These authors found that intensive agriculture and climate change, which are the top 2 bars in this chart, were the major drivers of UK species population changes, and that's both population increases and decreases. But it's not all big data. Here's one iconic specialist with a very simple story. As the climate warms, ptarmigan can't go further uphill, and they won't have time to evolve to cope. Their range will constrict as their preferred habitat disappears, and ptarmigan could even cease to be a Scottish species. So, climate change is the greatest threat to our nature, but we can fight back with nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions means actively enhancing or managing ecosystems to provide multiple benefits. Now, ecosystems could be as small as a hedgerow, but ideally it's at the largest scale possible, for example, a whole catchment. Nature-based solutions are by definition considered to be cost-effective. By valuing the ecosystem services provided, so back to ecosystem services, they are generally better value than traditional engineered solutions. Some examples of work that helps us meet multiple objectives in these ways are quite familiar. So peatland restoration stores carbon, reduces soil loss and downstream flooding, and it also supports specialist species and a very important habitat. Enhancing woodland along watercourses not only supports connectivity for species, but it can also reduce some of the impacts of floods on land use. Other examples are less obvious. So as seasons become more extreme in parts of Scotland, making sure in the spring and summer that we're better prepared to prevent and tackle wildfires isn't just an adaptation to climate change. It can also prevent very large releases of carbon dioxide from the burning vegetation and organic soils. So next, I'm going to look at a couple of examples in more detail. 25% of Scotland's area is peatland, and it contributes to multiple ecosystem services. But as I've said, ongoing emissions from degraded peatland are adding to climate heating. So peatland restoration really is vital. There is a long way to go, however, as the work that's been done so far is merely decreasing the amount of carbon dioxide being emitted from peatlands. Tens of millions of pounds have been invested, but this now needs to be scaled up. The government's budget for 2020-2021 announced funding of 20 million for peatland restoration, and this was the first step in a commitment of £250 million, working towards a total restoration of 250,000 hectares by 2030. It's a big piece of work. Another example was in response to the publication of key reports, those I talked about earlier. A partnership of conservation organisations, including NatureScot, worked to identify species action needed in Scotland, focusing on terrestrial and freshwater species. The resulting programme is called Species on the Edge. National Heritage Lottery funding was secured for the development phase, and a decision on further full funding is due in March 2022. The vision for the project is that coastal and island terrestrial and freshwater species urgently need our help to save them from extinction, to build resilience within their populations, and to address the pressures that have pushed them to the edge. The Species on the Edge project will deliver action for 40 of these vulnerable species across the 7 programme areas you can see. Now, some of the changes that have impacted on these species are caused by people, but people are also crucial to reversing them. So the project will work with communities, with local initiatives and land managers, hoping to use the species recovery work as a way to identify and tackle the barriers that prevent folk from getting involved. Much of this kind of work is embedded in or feeds into Scottish biodiversity strategy. This is currently made up of the 2004 strategy called It's in Your Hands, plus the 2020 challenge, which was published in 2013 to take account of the new international targets. I know strategies aren't everybody's cup of tea, but Scottish Government, NatureScot and our partners are working towards the next iteration of the strategy. And to that end, I'm obliged to mention that hot off the press just a few days ago on the 14th, Scottish Government published its new Biodiversity Statement of Intent. And we in NatureScot had worked closely with them on this. It's a shame about the front cover maybe, but here are 3 key elements of the Statement of Intent. Firstly, elements of the existing 2020 challenge and route map will continue immediately, but soon there will be a new Scottish biodiversity strategy aligned with work internationally. Most interesting perhaps is the ambition to extend the area of land protected for nature in Scotland to at least 30% by 2030, and to consider going even further. So it's time to wrap up. Let me consider one of those species on the edge, the Scottish Primrose. It currently lives at the northern extremity of the mainland and on Orkney, and as the climate warms, it could struggle to move north. As an endemic species, it's possible that the Scottish Primrose might benefit in future from an assisted conservation translocation to stop it becoming globally extinct. So at the moment, we can sometimes slow down the rate of decline in populations like this by addressing pressures, such as, for example, grazing. At some stage, however, these options are going to run out, and the dilemma could well be move it or lose it. Addressing a changing climate means we will be forced to find answers to difficult conservation questions. What's for certain is that wildlife recording will continue to be absolutely crucial. Thank you very much for listening.